Hello and welcome. As this time we come to the 15th weekend of our celebrations. The readings this time for our consideration from the first one, from the prophet Amos, chapter 7, verses 12 through 15. From the letter of Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. And from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 7 through 13. All right, so you remember we are following the story of Mark, that last time he had returned to his home village of Nazareth, that things had not gone so well there, and so that Jesus, we presume, is now returned to Capernaum, which we have seen on other occasions seems to have been the base for Jesus' teaching in the Galilee. Although there were many, and just in passing, there are many small villages or hamlets throughout the Galilee, okay? We're more familiar with the named ones because that's where Jesus is pictured as having said something or done something, but there are many other places where he may have visited in his time in the Galilee. The people in the ancient Mediterranean world not only, by the way, held strong beliefs about the existence of spirits, but they also ranked them according to power. So we may have mentioned this on other occasions, but spirits were a considered reality in the first century or in the Mediterranean world. And they ranked these spirits. The first and most important spirit, of course, was our God. The other spirits, secondly, would have been other gods, sons of God, or archangels. Then in the third ranking, so you can imagine ranking spirits, would have been the less powerful, non-human persons. So this would have included angels, spirits, and demons. And then fourthly would have been ranked humans, and even sometimes under them, creatures of lower than humans beings. Okay, so the world of spirits. The Greeks called hostile spirits demons. The Semites called hostile spirits unclean spirits. So even the terminology that was used and developed has little different, well, it means pretty much the same, but it's different terms. So you remember that back in chapter 5, Mark pictures Jesus as expelling unclean spirits out of persons. Now, we call this, one of the kind of interpretive words that is often used here, is we call them exorcisms. It is a term that is not used in the New Testament. So although there are movies and stories that are very popular about exorcisms and the use of that word, it is not a scriptural word here, okay? So it is maybe interesting in noting this as we pass. Jesus has authority. Now, where's all of this going? What we find Jesus is doing here is gathering his 12 disciples together, and he is going to give them the authority that he has received. That's why I point out of this little background of what Jesus' authority has been. And Jesus now shares this authority with the 12. So it also means that they will have the ability caused by unclean spirits. Now, often what the unclean spirits cause is sickness. So there's an equation here that sickness and the spirits that are not the good spirits have created this. I don't know if we, certainly not a way of thinking that we today would be familiar with, but certainly was something that was understood back in those times. So Jesus is now going to send them out with his power to proclaim the gospel. Now this is a development. We will be noticing this over the next couple of sessions. Again, a framework which is known as, we've talked about this, the sandwich technique of Mark. Namely, you start with a story, then you interject into the middle of it an episode, and then you conclude with the ending of that story. So what we will see here is Jesus now begins this episode by sending out his disciples. Now, how are they to go? He gives them some travel rules, okay? First of all, keep in mind that travel in those days, we, of course, perhaps do not imagine this, was both deviant and dangerous. Truth of the matter is that most people in the first century world did not leave the town or village or hamlet in which they had been born. So the idea of traveling around, even to traveling to markets, was not all that regular. Most people stayed where they were, okay? They farmed, they got the necessary foods they needed, the taxes were kind of brought to them, they paid them. So that's what I mean by saying that travel in the first century world was considered a deviant. Now, I don't mean that people didn't, but I do mean that it was not quite as popular, and that many people in their lifetime perhaps never actually went that far from where they had been originally grounded or born, okay? It was also dangerous because if you traveled, there were always robbers and ready. And keep in mind that a single walking, traveling person set himself and certainly herself up, if it happened to be a woman, to very difficult and dangerous circumstances. For that reason, traveling alone was seldom recommended. Often they traveled in pairs. Well, keep in mind that's one thing that certainly Jesus is sending his disciples out in pairs. But even though they go in pairs, it doesn't mean that there was just the two of them. I think, again, we tend to interpret and read these things in the light of our own times and of our own understanding. It is likely that pairs travel with caravans, that is, with others. So if you have a group of people traveling, the idea of safety is certainly much more the case, because robbers, unless there were a lot of them, would not attack caravans, and there was protection there, particularly if travel entailed staying someplace overnight. Keep in mind, we tend to think of traveling, well, how far is it by car from one place to another? But even if you had a group of people walking and traveling together, how many miles would you cover, or could you cover, if the place that you were going was more distant? So all of these are kind of issues that maybe we never really think of when it comes to when Jesus sending his disciples out. Now, with his power to do what? To teach and to heal. See, keep in mind that these are wonderful gifts that are now being extended by Jesus to his disciples. Now, he instructs them as to what they are not to take, okay? They are to only take, what you need. Take a staff, okay? Now, when we think of people with staff, we probably think more the need because of walking. But that was true. But a staff, when you took it with you, helped you walking, but it also could be a defense. If somebody kind of attacked you, you might be able to kind of hit them, or if some kind of wild animals or pestilence would come out of bushes or along the way, you could hit them. So staff was certainly a helpful item to take along. Now, what was it made of? Well, probably of wood or some kind, and people found ways to develop a handy staff. They were to wear sandals, and they were to take one tunic. All right, now, so for traveling, a walking stick, sandals, Mark says they should wear on their feet, and I often have mentioned this before and smile. Wearing sandals in those days was important because we always like to go barefoot in that, but keep in mind as you're walking along roads, and the roads were not the kind of roads that we have today, were muddy, and other creatures besides humans often went on these roads, and I leave that to your imagination, and they perhaps left behind little gifts, and if you stepped in it, you can imagine, well, anyway. So if you had a sandal, at least you had some protection against those possible situations. Also keep a tunic. Now the tunic, often people took double tunics. Jesus here advises that they take only one. So at the end of the day, you didn't take it to the local laundry to wash it and have it nice and clean for next month. No. You had to kind of stay with it. I know that would be difficult for some of my friends to can imagine wearing the same clothes the second day in a row. But in this case, it would be wearing it for the length of the journey. Okay. Now, don't take, interestingly, he says, don't take bread, don't take a bag, don't take money, and don't take a spare tunic. So why? Well, it would seem that austerity here requires trust in God, and that was one of the kind of hopes that Jesus had in mind when he told the disciples what to do. All right, so you got what their traveling paraphernalia was and wasn't, and why? Well, why not take anything? Because, and we have noticed this on other occasions, one of the standing traditions of the Middle East is that of hospitality, which means that when a stranger comes into your village and knocks at your door, you are asked to welcome that person. Now, there's a bit of a background here. First of all, when a stranger came to the village, they were always suspected of being up to no good and of plotting to damage the village. So when you think, oh, the stranger's who's just checking it out and village happens to be on the way through, maybe, but maybe not. So keep in mind that strangers in villages where people didn't know you were looked at with kind of suspicious eyes. So I mentioned this, again, it's all very practical, and you probably say, I would have thought of that too, but now that you mentioned it. So a stranger knocks on the door, and or whatever. Now, if you welcome that person into your house, a couple of things are to be noted. First of all, if the stranger is taken under the protection of the host, welcome into his house, no kind of this back and forth is to take place. And Once he has come into your house, the stranger is transformed into a temporary guest with the hopes that the two will part as friends. So it is true they could part as enemies, that was possible, but as long as that person was now in your household, you were expected to give him food, shelter, and most importantly, protection. So it was a wonderful kind of custom. And this, to some degree, is even prevalent in certain quarters of the Middle East today, but certainly was very respected in the first century world, the Mediterranean world. And I don't mean this was just something that Jewish communities did, but that Romans did too, so that it was a customary practice of hospitality. And Jesus is in some ways banking his teaching on that background. Now, what if they didn't receive you? What if you knocked on the door and they said, sorry, no one, you're not welcome, leave, or whatever the phrase might have been. It could have been, look, my wife doesn't like strange. See, but that doesn't work. If they reject you, what does Jesus say? Shake off the dust and move on. Now, shaking off the dust here was perceived as a major insult. It was, when you did this, it was a total rejection of the person who had done this. It could be perceived as a hostile kind of attitude. The belief was, you see, why did you shake off the dust? Again, keep in mind what we've been talking about in this session. That somehow the value system of the place was found in the dirt or dust of the place. And so if they rejected you, you didn't take anything of theirs with you. Hence, that was the shaking off of the dust of the village or hamlet as you moved on. It certainly indicated that they had no willingness to show hospitality, and that therefore they were breaking with the tradition. All right, so that's the advice that Jesus is telling his disciples. He's sending them out with his power, a power he has received from God. Keep in mind what we spoke about at the beginning, how there is a gradation here. So it is a gift that he has received. He is now, in turn, passing it on to his apostles or disciples as they make their journey. The first reading, therefore, and often you remember we say first readings were chosen to kind of match or contrast the gospel reading, comes from the prophet Amos. Prophet Amos began his work during the time of Jeroboam II, who was the king of Israel, and we know that he ruled between the years 783 to 743 before the common time. Now I mention this because sometimes it's difficult to place certain men into time frames, but since we know something of this king, we do know when his rule was. And so we believe that the activity of Amos is placed toward the end of his reign. So we're trying to know when exactly his mission was. Assyria, and there is a tension, we have mentioned this and seen this before in Old Testament. You have three groups who were seeking to kind of control the Middle East. And in this order they began. You had Assyria, followed by Babylon, followed by Persia. All right, so Assyria at this time seemed to have been in a weakened position, and that the two kingdoms at this point, again, a little bit of Hebraic background. Remember that the land of Palestine had been divided into two kingdoms, the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. The kingdom of the north was called Israel, the kingdom of the south was Judea. Both of these at this time, so there was a unity of thought in this regard, thought that it might be safe to kind of hedge their bets with Assyria, because Assyria, being a weak power, they could therefore join up with Egypt. This, always be careful of Egypt. So at Bethel, there was a shrine. It was, Bethel was the last town of the northern kingdom on the road to Jerusalem, kind of giving you a little geography lesson here. But interesting to kind of see what was the world in which these men lived and the world in which they rode. Now, Amos is a prophet who comes from the south, okay, Judea, and he comes north. And he is there greeted by a priest named Anizia. I hope I say that right, Anaziah. And he says to Amos, who is telling the Israelites, that is the people of the north, that they have been really needing to shape up. Now keep in mind, this is Amos 7. What happens in Amos 1 through 6? Amos is known as the social prophet. He is the first of the writing prophets. He is certainly, I'm not sure he's the kind of prophet you would have wanted to invite to dinner, a kind of grumpy prophet. He's the kind of prophet who can always see something wrong. Do you know people like that? 100 things go right, one thing is out of the 100 is not right. They get it, okay? Well, Amos was pretty good at that, but he really was concerned that the way in which the Israelites were living their lives was not according to the Torah, not according to the law. And he has some very graphic illustrations. I think throughout the year we get some other times in which Amos has been kind of pictured as teaching. But one of the examples, he says, well, you're so busy making money. Sound interesting? People are so interesting in how they can get more that even on the Sabbath, that is the day in which there was to be rest, they are plotting how the next day they can make an extra buck. So when you can imagine hearing these kind of concerns, the priest says, look, we don't need you up here. Go back to your own place. Visionary. Now, interestingly, he calls him a visionary or a seer. There's a little difference between a prophet and a visionary. A visionary, of course, as you might guess, has a vision of what things might be like in the future. And in that sense, they are looking to the future. We've mentioned on other occasions that that is not a good term to apply to the prophet. Prophet is much more concerned with how things are going on here. See, but in this case, Amos is saying things are not going to go too well if you make the alliances that you're anticipating here. So Amos, therefore, the first, as we mentioned, of the classical prophets. By that I mean he's the first to have his words written down, saved, and transmitted in a book. okay? Now when we, in terms of dating, you can see how this is interesting. His message, therefore, concerned social and political corruption of the northern kingdom. The priest says, "Get out of here, you fraud. Go back to where you were from." Now, it's at this point that Amos said, "Look, I didn't want this job. I was a tender of sycamore trees." Now, please do not think of the sycamore tree that you are familiar with, but it was a different kind of tree which had a lot of roots underground. Anyway, he says, that was my job. I was a farmer. I was happy doing this. But God called me to this mission, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm doing the things, or saying rather, the things that I am. It's not something that I wanted to do. Because I'm not a prophet, and I don't belong to the sons of prophets. By the way, there were groups, by the way, who were prophets who kind of hung out together, hence the phrase sons of prophets. We don't know very much about them, only that they existed, and only that they are mentioned often in the texts of the Old Testament. So I just pause a moment there. But as I say, he's pictured as a visionary. He says, however, that I received the call to prophecy while doing ordinary, everyday activities. So in that sense, Amos was a kind of very down-to-earth kind of guy. So that's the background for Amos being sent on a mission that he did not choose to take, but was given because the Lord had asked him to do it. Just in thinking, the sycamore, by the way, here, was a kind of mulberry tree, the fruit of which required, interestingly, you had to bruise the fruit in order to encourage its ripening. How do you like that? That sometimes nature had to be bruised in order to achieve a more successful end. So you can put that into your kind of thought as we look today now at the mission, as we mentioned, that is given to the disciples to carry out, commissioned with the power that Jesus had received from the Father. He was passing on to them to engage in unclean, unhealthy spirits, if indeed they were to emerge. We'll have to notice how successful the disciples were in this mission. It is, by the way, only in the synoptic tradition that the disciples in Jesus' own lifetime are sent out to go to the towns and villages that Jesus hoped to himself visit. It goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that there were many hamlets and towns that are not mentioned at all in the mission and in the times of Jesus, but that most likely he touched and was part of, and that he brought with him the disciples in this work. It's also perhaps, as we notice here, that Jesus does not work alone, but that he requires helpers. And in the synoptic tradition, those helpers are the disciples, although, and this again in conclusion is a characteristic of Mark's story of the disciples, they don't really often understand exactly what they are to be doing, but they continue to have faith in Jesus, and that enables them to do the work they do. Thank you for being with us, and again, hope to see you soon.